let's look at celebrity case studies. I said I would do Judy Garland. Let me move to her. Judy was 17 years old when she did The Wizard of Oz. Let me see if I can find her. She became popular, and her mother was very excited about her career and gave her uppers so that she could keep acting. As a teenager, when she was 17, after The Wizard of Oz, she became a very sought-after actress for all sorts of films and movies. So her career was skyrocketing off. And she married at the age of 20 in 1942, and one of the reasons she married is because she wanted to have a child. She married a man named David Rose. Well, because her career was going off, MGM Studios and her mother didn't want to have a baby, so they forced her to have an abortion with her husband. All three of them colluded against her, and she said that her mom said, "You can have lots of babies at the right time, but this is not the right time. I've talked it over with David, and he agrees with me." So they basically manipulated her into it, and she said that her mom said, "I'll handle everything." And she was driven to what she described as a dreary little establishment outside LA city limits, and there her pregnancy was terminated. She said her marriage collapsed the moment she consented to have an abortion. She told a close friend, "The marriage was never the same. Something was gone. It broke my heart." And she attempted to blunt her emotional trauma with prescription drugs that were an effective coping mechanism, only instead of the uppers, she's taking downers now. It was one of her many problems. And it's not uncommon for traumatized people to engage in repetitious behaviors as a means to release trauma-related tension. That's what we're talking about. So she goes on. One of the first things that happened to her after her abortion is she had a lot of sleep disturbances. That's why she took the pills. Her weight dropped to 94 pounds, so she became anorexic and stopped eating. And then she began an affair with a guy named Tyrone Powers. Her marriage collapsed. She begins an affair. And he was married, so he was completely unavailable. And what did she experience? What was the theme when David, MGM Studios, and her mother turned against her? It was abandonment and betrayal when she needed their support. So that becomes the theme. Let's look at it play itself out. She has this affair and has a pregnancy fantasy on the due date that her baby would have been born. So these dates are significant. She begged Tyrone to divorce his wife or she'd be forced to have an abortion. So she's setting up a traumatic reenactment. All the way around, even her choice of a new boyfriend is a married man. So he cast her off as her own baby had been, and what did she experience again? Abandonment and betrayal. And that's on the anniversary of her due date. When she would have been delivering a baby, she enters this pregnancy fantasy. And then she has a second affair with a guy named Joe Mankiewicz. His wife was mentally ill, and she knew that. In fact, the wife was in an asylum somewhere. What attracted her to him might have been that he had a little experience, and she was feeling out of control. And he actually saw that she was troubled, and he recommended counseling. And everyone noticed a change in her attitude after she began counseling. She started saying things like, "I'll live my own life and stop treating me like a child, and I'll do what I want." So you see her struggling to be autonomous and to direct her own life and to not have everybody controlling her. And they didn't like that at all. In fact, they actually had a meeting about it, and her rebellion sent her mother Ethel into a fury, and she went marching down to MGM to complain, to enlist the support of Mr. Mayer, and to end Judy's psychotherapy. Together, they plotted against her in a way that the same way that they conspired to end her pregnancy. And they clearly could see that something was wrong and that she needed help, but they continued to abort her developing sense of self. Mayer, projecting much of his own guilt onto Joe, ranted and raved in a verbal tirade, emphasizing themes of God, motherhood, and the studio. He went off completely. All these accusations, most of which originated from his own unconscious guilt, and both Ethel and Mayer had an investment in keeping their role in Judy's grief submerged, and so they wanted her so that she could remain their property and they could control her and exploit her and keep making a lot of money off of her. So it was a sad thing. Well, now it's the anniversary of her abortion a year later, and she tells Joe that she's pregnant. And they traveled to New York City, and he said he knew she wasn't pregnant, but it was one of those things he just had to go along with. And there in the clinic, they come out, they give her a pregnancy test, and they say, "You're not pregnant." And so she collapses to the ground in an abortion clinic, holding her womb, crying hysterically as she reenacts the loss of her baby in an abortion clinic. Much to her, then she ends up marrying Vincent Minnelli, and he was a very well-known effeminate homosexual. What do you think she's going to experience with him? Abandonment and betrayal, because he's got lots of lovers, and it was well known. But she did achieve one thing with Vincent. She got pregnant, and one of the first things she said is, "I'm going to have a baby, Mama, do you mind?" And after Liza Minnelli was born, she had a very serious postpartum depression, and she was afraid to be left alone with the baby. She confessed to having stage fright. What's stage fright? It's hyperarousal. So being alone with the baby triggered her abortion, and she didn't want to be with the baby. So she asked the nurse to please stay there. She had someone helping her with the child, and the nurse needed a day off. And on that day, Judy took a shard of glass, slit her wrist, slit her neck, and smashed the mirror, and ended up in the sanitarium. And so what's the traumatic reenactment? She's separated from her baby, and she looks like she is losing her mind. She said, "I wanted to black out the future as well as the past. I didn't want to live anymore. I wanted to hurt myself and others." And she had a paranoia her whole life. It was that someone was trying to harm her and that she had no one to fight for her. And that went out everywhere. Like, as her life deteriorated and as the crowds grew smaller, she always felt like she was being betrayed by her fans. She was really, had a lot of issues around that. Then she gets pregnant again, and this time her mother's very accepting of the pregnancy, and it progressed amidst a lot of depression and anxiety, and her desire for constant approval was pathological by this point. And when she had Lorna, the next baby was Lorna, she actually forbid her mother to come into the hospital. The hospital staff was instructed not to let her mom near the baby, to touch it, hold it, see it. And the mom lamented, "What have I ever done that she hates me so?" It's all about the trauma, isn't it? So that was Judy. I'll skip her because I don't think anyone remembers. It's Terry McGovern, from George McGovern, who ran for president a long time ago. You might remember that she made headlines for dying of alcoholism. She stumbled out of a bar in Milwaukee and was found frozen in the morning. And they spent literally thousands and thousands of dollars trying to get her treatment. And then he wrote a book, George McGovern wrote a book about her drinking, and he continually he went back and looked in all her diaries, and it was in her diaries that she disclosed this abortion that the family knew about. They actually pressured her to have it, but her feelings about it were sort of locked away in the diary. He struggled to understand her addiction, and then he wrote the story about it. She began drinking at the age of 13, and no one regarded her drinking beyond the level of what other kids might experiment with. But she had this boyfriend who was always pressuring her to have sex, and constantly. And one night, after she refused his advances, the boyfriend actually went home and he shot himself in the abdomen. It wasn't a life-threatening thing, but it was like, so the next time he asked her for sex, what do you think she did? So it was a big emotional manipulation move. Have sex with me or I'll kill myself, which wasn't very good, but but this time, frightened by his near suicide, Terry gave in and became pregnant the very first time she had intercourse. The family consulted with her doctor and made the decision that Terry would undergo an abortion because they felt it was in her best interest. She underwent the abortion at the age of 15, and afterwards McGovern noticed that she spiraled out of control with depression, loneliness, and just overwhelmed all the time. It was undoubtedly a trauma that impacted her on levels that those who were trying to support her didn't understand at all. He said an important part of Terry was devastated by the abortion. Her innocence, her fun-loving nature, and her self-confidence were all deeply shaken, first by an unpleasant sexual experience, and then by a pregnancy that she feared but did not want to terminate. And then her academic performance slumped into the toilet. Instead of being the straight-A student she was before, she was having D's and F's, and they were really troubled. And they wanted to give her a fresh start and separate her from Bill, so they sent her away to a boarding school. They wanted to help her move on, but she never did. And she turned to marijuana and barbiturates while she was away at school to try to help her cope with the pain. And this was very troubling because he was running for president at the time, and he was taking a very hard line that anyone caught with marijuana should be put in jail. So this was a little troubling for the career. She said, I grieved. I should not have been sent away. I cut my hair so I wouldn't look sexual to my father and be a reminder to him that I was sexual and got pregnant. I felt like I lost my dad and was so focused on that, and I'd lost a great deal more: my virginity, my baby, my security, and then Bill. And the only way I felt like I could tolerate all those losses was to totally mesh myself and Bill. This is called traumatic bonding. When you share something with someone like that, then you're obsessed with them later, and I'll show you some other examples of how that works out with people. And my fear was unbearable when he left me. I had no choice but to take drugs. My parents thrust me again into a new setting in the hope that I would stabilize and find myself. And it would have been okay if the wounds had been acknowledged and taken care of. It would have been a good plan if I didn't already feel so ashamed and I couldn't fit into a healthy environment. And she was like daddy's little girl. She always had a very loving, special relationship with him, but that was over after this abortion. And afterwards, she had frequent altercations with her family over little and big things where she tried to assert her own independence. And McGovern said, we were baffled by her behavior and her eroding performance in school. And no one that they conferred with, they saw the best specialist, could offer any insight. Then she was arrested for possession of marijuana and threatened imprisonment and possibly the termination of, like, she would show up for interviews with the family, for the media, for his candidacy, stoned out of her mind. She was such an embarrassment. In a way, you could say she was trying to derail his political career the way he had derailed her emerging motherhood. That would be another traumatic reenactment. And then her depression was chronic. She said, I can't stand what's happening to me. I'm so sad and discouraged about my life that I don't think I can keep going. And at one point, the doctors were so upset by concerned about her depression that they placed her in a locked psychiatric ward and assessed that she was a threat to herself and required continual surveillance. So she said her first suicide attempt was at the age of 19. She pleaded with friends through her tears, why am I so messed up? And the crazy-making part of this is that no one was allowing her abortion to be the reason that started all this, the grief and loss that she suffered. Anyway, then the acts of reparative healing that she's trying to do are everywhere. She writes about the longing for someone to love and protect her. And then she met Ray, a married man with 2 children who was getting a divorce. And when she became pregnant with Ray's child, she invited her dad to attend the delivery. How many of you had your dad in the delivery room? It's a little unusual, but I think she was trying to feel close to him and put her baby in his face that he would have to accept. So he says, I found this eyewitness both thrilling and painful. Terry seemed to know that if her emotionally reserved dad actually observed the birth of her daughter, it would produce a special bonding between my first grandchild and me. It wasn't the first grandchild. She was right. I felt as though I were part of the birthing process. I must confess that I so empathized with every motion during labor that when it was over, I had severe stomach cramps, as though I had been in labor myself. He was unconscious about what was going on in him, but we know that sick feeling that people have in their stomach when memories are being surfaced you can't deal with, and I'm sure he's focusing on a lot of other things. He said, I was almost too weak to stand after all those labor pains. But she wanted him to desperately to acknowledge her motherhood. And then she had another thing where she was caring for wounded birds, like from oil spills, and she would take these wounded, helpless birds with broken wings and try to nurse them back to health, taking care of something fragile and nurturing it, which would have been a way to compensate and try to feel her ability to protect and care for something vulnerable. And that's a mirror for what she wasn't able to do in her adolescence. So in the end, her addiction got her after they tried to get her all the help in the world, but she was never treated for abortion trauma. This is Hillary Clinton. By the way, I hired a new intern. Her name is Lorena Bobbitt. And Lorena Bobbitt, of course, hit headlines when she cut off her husband's reproductive organ with a kitchen butcher knife. And she was held up as the victory poster child by all the feminists, and she was never convicted because they saw it as victory, snip, snip. And right after that crime happened, I had a patient come into my office and say someone finally did it, because she had had fantasies about castrating her boyfriend for many years. And she was very obsessed with him. She used to sort of stalk his apartment. She didn't want him to move on with her life when she was suffering so badly. And as we looked at the details of Lorena's case that was never allowed in court, unfortunately, and Ann Speckert was the forensics expert, and Ann was telling me all about the case at the time, and no testimony was allowed to come up about her abortion. And Barbara Walters interviewed her and said, "What were you thinking the day of the cutting?" And Lorena looked deadpan at the camera and said, "My abortion." So it was on the anniversary week of her abortion. She was a Hispanic woman and thought the greatest gift you could give your husband is the gift of a child, and he didn't want it. And after her abortion, she developed a sexual dysfunction called dyspareunia, which is where the vagina locks shut from the trauma. And so he couldn't have normal intercourse with her, and then he began acts of sodomy, huge domestic violence. Every time she cried, it would make him rage, and he would hit her. And that was all going on behind the scenes. And I write the full story out in Forbidden Grief if you're interested in more of the Lorena Bobbitt case. Monica Lewinsky was being treated for post-abortion trauma when she began her affair with the president. So she got pregnant by somebody on the Hill, was on antidepressants at the time, was in therapy, and then she began her affair. Remember what we said about high-risk activities? You can imagine that being under the table of the Oval Office while he's on the phone with Russia, that there was a little bit of heart pounding going there. She must have felt very alive. Then you look at all the shame and the humiliation and the aftermath and how she saved the dress and everything, just like saving the symptoms of the crime. I mean, the evidence of the crime. But it was a humiliating thing. And Bill Clinton's a post-abortive father. Surprise, surprise. Some of these people are very into Planned Parenthood and the whole abortion agenda to justify what they did. He had an abortion with Jennifer Flowers, and she writes about it in her biography, Passion and Betrayal. She said the abortion itself was painful, and there was nothing to ease the pain, and the procedure is demeaning. The poor woman lies flat on her back, legs up in those hateful stirrups, with an impersonal tool ready to enter her body and remove something very personal. After it was over, I went and sat in a chair and sobbed, partly from the physical pain, and partly because I felt totally devastated. And since then, I've wondered how well a man could endure such an experience. And Bill called her shortly after she got home to find out how she was doing. She said, I didn't reassure him. I was uncomfortable and very upset, but I was touched by his concern. Camille Claudel was considered one of the first feminists because she was the first woman to become, she was the first woman artist that was recognized for her tremendous talent. She was a sculptress. She was so talented they sent her to study under Rodin. You know Rodin, the famous sculptor? And she ended up becoming his, he had an affair with her. that lasted for a while, and he drew a lot of his inspiration from her beauty. Instead of teaching her to sculpt, he asked her to strip naked so that he could sculpt her. And he ended up getting her pregnant, and she was only 19, and he was 43. So it was very cruel, because after she had the abortion, he turned his back on her, and she would go with that traumatic bonding to his house because she wanted to see him. She wanted to be with him. She would take rocks and throw them at the house, and then the servants would close the shutters and pretend that no one was home, and they wouldn't come out to her. This made her a little crazy. Here's some of her artwork. Here she is. This is the implorer. She's begging him to come back to her. And she started making a lot of her artwork to reveal, this is l'abandon, it's called, because he abandoned her. After a while, her artwork became very grotesque. It became obsessed. She started to sculpt old women with shriveled breasts, skeletons, death, dying. Instead of the beauty of the art that was formerly her passion, everything the dark side. In 1906, she destroyed much of her artwork. In violent fits of crushing grief, she shattered her priceless art collection into unrecognizable pieces, dramatically reenacting the destruction of her procreative self. When an artist gives birth to a piece of work, they always say it's an expression of themselves, part of themselves, and certainly what we call our children, they're a part of ourselves. So that child was destroyed. She went on to destroy an entire with a sledgehammer. So if she was your patient, what would you diagnose her? Well, she definitely had the trauma, but in those days, they didn't have 3 days of 24-hour hospitalization and then you get back on the street. In those days, you act like that, they think you're crazy. They put her in an asylum, and there she rotted. She used to write letters to her brother, who was a theologian, all these letters of loss and grieving, and she wasn't even able to do any art, which would have been very healing for her probably. In fact, I think she started with the obsession of the death because she was struggling to come to grips with the thing that had wreaked her world into a state of high trauma. So the oppression of women's life-giving gift turned grief still continues today, misunderstood, mismanaged, and locked away. It's much too threatening. And I like that story because it's from the 1800s. And way back then, we haven't come very far in 100 years where we would recognize grief from pregnancy loss. And I have a personal story to share. My grandmother, my mom's mom, had a child that was, when they cut the cord, they cut it with unsterile instruments. And so the baby developed blood poisoning. And my grandmother stayed up day and night and day, so she had sleep deprivation, trying to nurse this baby. And the one night that she fell asleep, the baby died. So she wasn't there when it happened. She had sleep deprivation. And then she would hear the baby crying in the night, which is an auditory hallucination, even though the child was dead. She would get up and go looking for the baby so she could take care of it. And my grandfather would follow her and say, "Margaret, our baby's gone." And because this was going on, they took her to a doctor and they put her in a hospital because we didn't know much about mental health. My mom remembers, my mom was about 6 years old and she had 2 other brothers. And she remembers going to visit her, and her mom missed her and couldn't wait to come home. But you were a guinea pig then, as I think you are now with some of these drugs, and they gave her shock treatment. And when the shock treatment was over, she didn't recognize her own children. And I've always seen that as kind of an analogy of abortion's a type of shock treatment that leaves women unable to recognize their own children. And 72% of all electroconvulsive therapy is performed on women. And that, of course, has big ramification on the children that are there, and everything that happened after that for my own mom, and the rest of society. Princess Diana had an abortion after having a secret affair before her divorce. It was with a guy named Oliver O'Hare. He was an Islamic art dealer. And in 1994, she was unhinged with misery and grief. What did she come out with after that abortion was that she had an eating disorder. She was bulimic. She wanted everybody to know she wasn't the perfect princess, but she never disclosed her abortion. And she thought it was a little girl, and she always wanted a little girl. And they thought that the scandal would be too much for Buckingham Palace to have her with an out-of-wedlock pregnancy in the press and everything else. I mean, not out-of-wedlock, an affair. And of course, it would have been a little Arabic baby, so it'd be hard to say it was Prince Charles. According to Lady Colin Campbell, Diana's misery over her abortion had altered her state of mind to such an extent that she wasn't responsible for her actions. She couldn't help herself. Day in and day out, she would call Oliver's house 30, 40, 50 times a day. This is an obsession. She was obsessed. She has a traumatic bonding with him. She wants to reach him, and you know what? He's married. So sometimes his wife would pick up, and then she'd hang up, and then she'd try again later, hoping she'd get Oliver. This is before cell phones. When she'd call from her sister's home, she was absolutely desperate. She'd go out to call boxes on High Street. One night she slipped out wearing only diamond earrings, a fur coat, no underpants, and stiletto heels. It wasn't until I was teaching in London and I'm telling this story that all these people came up to me, and there's an expression for when you lose your mind in England, and it's called no ninnies and a fur. Ninnies means underwear. So here she is doing this very common expression in England that means you're crazy. So she's dressing, and she's stumbling on the side of the road in a totally dissociated state. They picked her up. She didn't even know who she was. So that was one of those dissociative episodes, fugue. And then she started making a lot of trips to Mother Teresa. And I think they became very good friends because she was probably seeking reconciliation and healing from who she considered a very wonderful spiritual leader. And then she engaged in great humanitarian acts. Do you remember what her cause was? It was removing landmines to stop children from being blown to pieces. And this is where her cause is directly related to trying to repair the trauma, right? Marilyn Manson is a singer, in case you don't buy a lot of his albums. But here's an example of his traumatic reenactment. He had a memory as a child of, I gotta close up. He had a memory of a child of finding a fetus in a coffee cup in his mother's bathroom. And he thought that that was an abortion. I don't know whether it was I don't know what, but there was a fetus in a coffee cup. And he remembers seeing that. And then as he gets older, he always thought he was a survivor of abortion. And he said, I got a face that's made for doing violence. This is Disposable Teens, one of his hits. I got a face that's made for doing violence upon. I'm a teen distortion, survived abortion, a rebel from the waist down. We're disposable teens, but the song goes on like that. The more you fear us, the bigger we get. The more you fear us, the bigger we get. Don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when we destroy all of it. So he gets his girlfriend pregnant, and he's in the women's waiting room wondering what's going on. This is from his biography. 3 rooms away, as doctors were tearing out the brains of our child with a pair of forceps. He remembers leaving the clinic, going out to get a cup of coffee, and he's staring into the coffee cup as he's wondering these thoughts. So it's clear traumatic reenactment. And then this is a graphic picture, which I'm going to show so you can close your eyes, but it was the cover of his next album after the abortion. So if you don't want to see a graphic picture, close your eyes. I'll show it now, and then I'll get it off the screen. 1, 2, 3. Whoops. There you go. So that was the cover. Then we have Sharon Osbourne, who couldn't conquer bulimia. Even after having her stomach stapled to stop binging, she would vomit 3 times a day, binging until she was sick. She had an abortion at 17 after getting pregnant the first time she ever had sex. She said it was the worst thing I ever did. My mom was so angry, and her mother sent her alone to the clinic to have an abortion, like a big punishment. And then she was addicted to plastic surgery, all kinds of plastic surgery. She had 3 miscarriages before she had her children. And she believed that each miscarriage was a punishment for the abortion. And she said, in life you pay somewhere down the line. And when she had breast cancer, she thought that was also a punishment for her abortions. And of course, she was someone who didn't have a whole lot of boundaries in her own home. Anybody that watched the reality TV show could see that her dogs would urinate on the carpet, and her kids were out of control, and that she didn't feel like she could set boundaries with anybody. And again, we're looking at the developmental task. Her abortion happened as a 17-year-old. She didn't develop after that, as a lot of people don't. She's doing really well now, though, I think, after all these years, but nobody had any respect for the matriarch, and she allowed that. Britney Spears was interesting because, when she all went crazy, she had an abortion, and after that, she ends up hooking up with Kevin Federline, who was, anyone could see a train wreck ready to happen. He already had another girl pregnant who he wasn't with, and she hadn't even delivered yet when he's going with Britney. And then when Britney she ended up losing custody of the children, didn't appear for court, and Kevin Federline is the one that looks like the handsome prince that should be in charge. But a lot of that acting out, and all these commentators were saying that she was bipolar. Britney would have exhibited symptoms of bipolar long before this, if she was, but she was a very focused, stable in her career from Mickey Mouse on up, and just the lifestyle, but shaving her head, anything sexual, this is very consistent with trauma that she had suffered. And Whitney Houston had a traumatic abortion, and I had played earlier her song, The Miracle. And the last person I'll tell you about, because we gotta go, is Maureen McCormick. In 1974, at the age of 18, she did write a book called Here's the Story. I don't know if anybody read it, but she said that she was doing a lot of partying when she was 18, and when she missed her period, she had the scary suspicion as to why, but still waited more than a week just to be sure. And when she got a pregnancy test, it came back positive, and she sat down Eric, her boyfriend, in the living room and told him the news. But she broke down before getting the words out, and he assured her that everything would be okay, and they both agreed they weren't ready to have a child, and she wasn't prepared to carry a baby to term or give it up for adoption, and so she said, I needed to get an abortion. And they didn't discuss it in depth, but they discussed it enough to keep reassuring each other that they were making the best decision for them. And her parents handled all the finances, so she wasn't about to ask him for the money, but he paid for it. Anyway, as life goes on, she gets more and more into drugs afterwards, really badly. And she started hearing voices at the age of 20, so she has the abortion at 18, and she's hearing voices. She said, we had been together slightly more than a year, and I started hearing voices. They came at night, and they also came when she was doing coke. And that can happen under drugs. While Eric wouldn't stop and go to bed, I couldn't. While he would go to bed, I couldn't. As a general rule, I didn't stop doing coke until it was all gone, and thanks to Bill, we usually had enough to keep me up for 2 or 3 days round the clock, tooting. It was during the wee hours when I was hunkered down with my stash and backgammon board that I first heard the sounds outside, and she didn't know why they were occurring. And then she would go out to investigate, open the door, look out the window, ask if anyone was there, or shout, go away, wolves. And she said they did have coyotes and deers in the neighborhood, but she started to convince herself that the police were hiding behind the trees and bushes, waiting for the right time to stage a raid and arrest her. So she's having paranoid thoughts about the police. I was completely paranoid, and she kept self-medicating, but she said I was out of control. And now she talks about another dream that she kept having when she wasn't on coke. In it, I had killed someone. It was always right after the fact. I never knew exactly how I had killed that person or any other details, like where it was, whether it was a man or a woman or a boy or a girl. I was filled with the dread of having done it. And in one variation, Bill and Andy helped me bury the person. It was so real to me that the next time Eric and I went on a hike in the hills near our home, I kept an eye out for all the signs and clearing where we had buried the body. So she's looking for the body. In her obsession, she's out hiking and always looking, scanning, trying to remember where she put it. After enough of these nightmares, I wonder if I actually had committed such a crime. I didn't think so, but I honestly didn't know. All I knew is I didn't want to go to sleep. So she feels all this, and then there's a breakup, life goes on, but these are the kind of things that she was struggling with. And she said it was my mother, though, who surprised me by stepping up and nursing me through the entire procedure. This is when she had another abortion. Her mom came and was there with her. So then she had a miscarriage, and she was completely devastated. It triggered a really, really big depression, and after that she was compulsive overeater, gained a lot of weight, lost her career. And it was when she wrote this book that she was kind of coming out of hiding from many years of her depression. And of course, Marilyn Monroe had, I think, 5 or 6 abortions, and we all know her prescription thing. The leading cause of death during pregnancy is homicide. Did you hear that? A study of violent deaths among pregnant women, 3 out of every 4 were killed during the first 20 weeks of pregnancy. Men often attribute the motive as not wanting to pay child support. And with all the abortion drugs we have now, a lot of guys are slipping these drugs into women's drinks, and unless you find out that's what happens, so whether you want it or not, it's not your choice. You can be given these drugs. So we're going to stop there.